The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile corridors of Metropolitan General Hospital as Sarah Martinez adjusted her scrubs and checked her watch. 23 years old and fresh out of nursing school, she had been working the night shift for only 3 months, but already the weight of responsibility felt familiar on her shoulders. The emergency department never slept, and neither did the challenges that came with it. Sarah had chosen nursing because she believed in helping people during their most vulnerable moments. Growing up in a working-class family where her mother cleaned office buildings and her father worked construction, she understood what it meant to struggle. Every patient who came through those sliding glass doors represented someone's family member, someone's world turned upside down by illness or injury. The hospital where she worked was owned by Meridian Health Corporation, a massive healthcare conglomerate that operated facilities across 3 states. The company's CEO, Marcus Wellington, was known throughout the industry as a ruthless businessman who prioritized profit margins over patient care. Wellington had built his empire by acquiring struggling hospitals, cutting staff to the bone, and implementing cost-saving measures that often compromised the quality of care. At 48 years old, Wellington commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. Standing 6 feet tall with silver hair and cold gray eyes, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. His expensive suits and Italian leather shoes were a stark contrast to the modest uniforms worn by the hospital staff, who actually saved lives every day. Sarah had heard stories about Wellington from the older nurses who had worked at Metropolitan General before the corporate takeover. They spoke in hushed tones about how he would make surprise visits to cut budgets, eliminate positions, and intimidate staff members who dared to question his decisions. Many experienced nurses had left for other facilities, unable to tolerate the toxic environment he had created. On this particular Tuesday evening, Sarah was assigned to the trauma bay, where the most critical cases arrived. The emergency department was understaffed, as usual, with only 2 nurses covering what should have been a 4-nurse shift. Budget cuts had forced the hospital to operate with skeleton crews, putting both patients and staff at risk. Around 10 o'clock, an ambulance arrived with an elderly man experiencing chest pain. Harold Thompson, 72 years old, had collapsed at his daughter's house during a family dinner. His wife of 50 years, Margaret, rode in the ambulance, clutching his hand and whispering words of encouragement through her tears. Sarah immediately took charge of Mr. Thompson's care, hooking him up to monitoring equipment and starting an IV line with practiced efficiency. The man's condition was serious but stable, and she worked quickly to ensure he received the pain medication and oxygen he needed while waiting for the cardiologist to arrive. Margaret Thompson stood beside the gurney, her weathered hands shaking as she watched the monitors beep and flash. She had never seen her husband look so frail and vulnerable. Sarah noticed the woman's distress and took a moment to explain what was happening, speaking in gentle, reassuring tones. "Mrs. Thompson, your husband is receiving excellent care," Sarah said, placing a comforting hand on the older woman's shoulder. "The medications are helping with his pain, and the doctor will be here soon to determine the best treatment plan. I know this is frightening, but he's in good hands." Margaret's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, dear. You're so kind. I don't know what I would do without him." Sarah spent the next hour monitoring Mr. Tussoff, Thompson's vital signs, and providing updates to his anxious family members who had gathered in the waiting room. She noticed that his condition was improving with treatment, and the cardiologist confirmed that while he had experienced a minor heart attack, the damage was minimal and treatable. However, what Sarah didn't know was that Mr. Thompson's insurance had lapsed the previous month due to a paperwork error at his former employer. When the billing department discovered this information, they immediately flagged his case as a potential financial liability for the hospital. Marcus Wellington happened to be conducting one of his late-night facility reviews, personally inspecting departments to identify areas where costs could be further reduced. When he received the notification about Mr. Thompson's insurance status, his cold business calculations kicked into overdrive. Wellington saw an opportunity to send a message to his staff about the hospital's priorities. He had been looking for a way to demonstrate that financial considerations would always trump emotional appeals for charity care. In his mind, allowing uninsured patients to receive expensive treatment set a dangerous precedent that could hurt the hospital's bottom line. The CEO made his way to the trauma bay, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor with purposeful strides. He had built his reputation on making tough decisions that other executives were too weak to make, and tonight would be no different. Sarah was adjusting Mr. Thompson's oxygen mask when Wellington appeared at the entrance to the treatment room. She had never seen the CEO in person before, but his expensive suit and commanding presence immediately identified him as someone important. What she didn't expect was the hostile expression on his face as he surveyed the scene. "Nurse," Wellington said sharply, not bothering to learn her name. "I need to speak with you immediately." Sarah glanced at Mr. Gate, Thompson, who was resting comfortably but still required monitoring. "Of course, sir. Let me just check on my patient first." Now, Wellington's voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Reluctantly, Sarah followed him to a quiet corner of the trauma bay, within earshot of the treatment room but away from the immediate bedside. She could see Mrs. Thompson still holding her husband's hand, and other family members anxiously waiting for updates. "This patient's insurance has been denied," Wellington stated without preamble. "I'm instructing you to begin discharge procedures immediately." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Sir, I'm sorry, but Mr. Petibo, Thompson just suffered a heart attack. The cardiologist wants to keep him for observation and possibly perform additional tests. He's not ready for discharge." Wellington's gray eyes narrowed. The hospital cannot absorb the cost of treating uninsured patients. Every minute he remains here represents a financial loss that impacts our ability to serve other patients. "But he could die if we discharge him now," Sarah protested, her voice rising slightly. "His condition has stabilized, but he needs continued monitoring. The standard of care requires at least 24 hours of observation after a cardiac event." "The standard of care is determined by the patient's ability to pay," Wellington replied coldly. "This is a business, not a charity. I'm giving you a direct order to begin discharge procedures." Sarah felt her hands trembling with a combination of fear and outrage. She had taken an oath to do no harm, and discharging Mr. Sovo, and forgotten that discharging Mr. Sovo on medicinal Thompson prematurely could have fatal consequences. But she also knew that defying a direct order from the CEO could cost her job, and she needed this position to pay off her nursing school loans. "Sir, I understand your concerns about costs, but I cannot in good conscience discharge a patient who requires continued medical care. It would violate my professional obligations and potentially endanger his life." Wellington's face darkened with anger. He was not accustomed to having his authority questioned, especially by a young nurse who he viewed as easily replaceable. In his world, employees who challenged his decisions were problems to be eliminated. "You seem to be confused about your role here," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You are an employee of this corporation, and your job is to follow orders, not to make medical decisions above your pay grade."
"With all due respect, sir, providing safe patient care is exactly my job," Sarah replied, finding strength in her convictions despite her fear.
"I cannot discharge a patient against medical advice when doing so could result in serious harm or death." The confrontation was beginning to attract attention from other staff members in the trauma bay. A security guard stationed near the entrance had noticed the heated discussion and was moving closer to investigate. Wellington realized that the situation was escalating beyond his intended scope, but his pride prevented him from backing down. "You will discharge this patient immediately, or you will find yourself unemployed," Wellington threatened. "I don't care what excuses you think you have. This is my hospital, and what I say goes." Sarah looked back at Mr. Thompson, who appeared peaceful and stable on the gurney, unaware of the battle being fought over his care. His wife continued to hold his hand, trusting that the medical professionals around them were working in her husband's best interest. The weight of that trust felt heavier than ever. "I'm sorry, sir, but I cannot and will not discharge this patient," Sarah said firmly. "If you want him discharged against medical advice, you'll need to find someone else to do it, because I won't compromise patient safety for financial reasons." Wellington's composure finally cracked completely. The young nurse's defiance had pushed him beyond his breaking point, and years of unchecked authority had convinced him that he could intimidate anyone into submission. What happened next would change everything for everyone involved. The CEO's face flushed red with rage as he realized that his authority was being challenged by someone he considered beneath his notice. In that moment, his business instincts were overwhelmed by pure fury at being defied. He had built his career on crushing opposition, and he wasn't about to let a 23-year-old nurse damage his reputation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the true character of everyone involved and transform what should have been a routine medical case into something much more significant. Neither Sarah nor Wellington fully understood the forces they were about to unleash, but the trajectory was already set in motion. The tension in the trauma bay had reached a breaking point. Wellington's face was flushed with anger, his carefully maintained corporate composure completely shattered by Sarah's refusal to follow his orders. The other medical staff in the area had begun to take notice of the heated exchange, though most tried to continue their work while stealing glances at the unfolding drama. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the attending physician overseeing the emergency department that night, had been reviewing charts at the nurses' station when she heard voices rising from the direction of Mr. Thompson's treatment area. As a 15-year veteran of emergency medicine, she had seen her share of difficult situations, but something about the tone of this particular argument made her look up from her paperwork. Wellington had not noticed Dr. Reeves approaching, his attention completely focused on the young nurse who had dared to challenge his authority. In his mind, this was no longer about Mr. Thompson's medical care or even the hospital's financial interests. This had become a personal battle for control, and he was determined to win it decisively.
"I've had enough of your insubordination," Wellington hissed at Sarah, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Security!" The security guard who had been observing from a distance quickly approached, unsure of what was expected of him, but recognizing the authority in Wellington's voice.
Officer James Mitchell was a former police officer who had taken the hospital's security job after retiring from the force. He had always tried to maintain order through de-escalation rather than confrontation, but the CEO's commanding presence put him in an uncomfortable position. "Yes, sir?" Mitchell asked cautiously, hoping to understand the situation before taking any action. Wellington pointed an accusatory finger at Sarah, who stood her ground despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "This nurse is refusing to follow direct orders and interfering with hospital operations. I want her removed from the premises immediately." Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized the full scope of what was happening. Not only was her job in jeopardy, but she was now facing the possibility of being physically removed from the hospital while her patient still needed care. The injustice of the situation fueled her determination to stand firm. "Officer Mitchell," Sarah said, addressing the security guard directly, "I'm not interfering with anything. I'm trying to provide appropriate medical care for a patient who suffered a heart attack. Discharging him now could be life-threatening." Dr. Reeves had arrived close enough to hear this exchange, and her expression immediately shifted to one of concern. As the attending physician, she was ultimately responsible for all medical decisions in the emergency department, and the idea that someone was pressuring nurses to discharge patients against medical judgment set off every alarm bell in her professional mind. "What's going on here?" Reeves asked firmly, stepping into the group with the confidence that came from years of managing crisis situations. Wellington turned toward the doctor, expecting immediate deference to his authority. "Doctor, I was just explaining to this nurse that we need to discharge the uninsured patient in bed 3. She's being uncooperative." Dr. Reeves glanced toward Mr. Thompson's bed where the elderly man was resting peacefully under his wife's watchful eye. She had personally reviewed his case earlier and knew that discharge at this point would violate every standard of emergency cardiac care. "Mr. Wellington, Dr. Reeves said carefully, using his name to establish that she knew exactly who he was. "Mr. Thompson is not medically ready for discharge. He requires continued observation and possible intervention. Discharging him now would be negligent." The CEO's anger flared even higher at finding himself opposed by both the nurse and the doctor. In his corporate world, medical staff were employees to be managed, not colleagues to be consulted. The fact that they were uniting against his authority struck him as a coordinated act of rebellion that needed to be crushed immediately. "The patient's insurance has been denied," Wellington stated coldly. "This hospital cannot afford to provide free care to every person who walks through those doors. The financial reality is that uninsured patients must be transferred to county facilities." "The financial reality, Doctor," Reeves replied with steel in her voice, is that this hospital has a legal and ethical obligation to stabilize emergency patients before considering transfer. Moving Mr. Thompson in his current condition would violate federal EMTALA regulations and expose the hospital to significant liability. Wellington was not accustomed to having his business decisions challenged on legal grounds, and the doctor's reference to federal regulations introduced complexities he had not considered. However, his pride prevented him from backing down, especially with multiple staff members watching the confrontation. "I don't need lectures about hospital regulations from medical staff," Wellington snapped. "I'm the CEO of this corporation, and my decisions are final. If you won't handle this situation appropriately, I'll find staff who will." The threat hung in the air like a poison cloud. Everyone present understood that Wellington had the power to fire both Sarah and Dr. Reeves, regardless of the medical or legal justifications for their position. The hospital's corporate structure gave him almost unlimited authority over personnel decisions. Sarah felt a wave of nausea as she contemplated losing her job so early in her career. She had student loans to pay and a younger brother whose college tuition depended partly on her financial support. But every time she looked at Mr. Thompson, she saw her own grandfather, who had died of a heart attack when she was 12. The memory of that loss strengthened her resolve. "Sir," Sarah said quietly but firmly, "I understand that you have the authority to fire me, but I cannot participate in discharging a patient who needs continued medical care. My nursing license and my conscience won't allow it." Wellington's eyes blazed with fury. The young nurse's continued defiance was undermining his authority in front of multiple witnesses, and he knew that word of this confrontation would spread throughout the hospital within hours. If he allowed himself to be challenged successfully, it would encourage other staff members to question his decisions. "Your conscience is not my concern," Wellington snarled. "Your job is to follow orders, and if you can't do that, you have no business working here." Reeves stepped closer to Sarah in a gesture of solidarity. "Nurse Martinez is absolutely correct in her assessment. Mr. Thompson requires continued monitoring, and any attempt to discharge him prematurely would be medically inappropriate." The support from Dr. Reeves gave Sarah courage, but it also escalated the situation beyond a simple dispute between the CEO and a nurse. Wellington now faced a coordinated challenge to his authority from multiple medical professionals, and his response would determine the hospital's culture for years to come. Officer Mitchell found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. As a former police officer, he understood the importance of following proper procedures and protecting people from harm. But as a hospital employee, he was expected to follow orders from the administration. The conflicting loyalties created an internal tension that showed on his face. "Officer Mitchell," Wellington commanded, "I want this nurse escorted from the building immediately. She's disrupting hospital operations and refusing to follow direct orders." Mitchell looked uncertainly between Wellington and Sarah, then toward Dr. Reeves, who was shaking her head in disapproval. "Sir, maybe we should discuss this in your office rather than in the patient care area." "There's nothing to discuss," Wellington exploded. "I've given you a direct order. Either follow it or join her in the unemployment line." The threat to Officer Mitchell represented a new escalation in Wellington's tactics. The CEO was now willing to fire multiple employees in pursuit of his goals, demonstrating that this confrontation had moved far beyond the original issue of Mr. Thompson's care. Sarah felt responsible for putting others at risk and considered backing down to protect her colleagues. But then she thought about all the future patients who might suffer if Wellington's approach went unchallenged. Someone needed to take a stand for what was right, even if it came at personal cost. "Mr. Wellington," Sarah said with as much dignity as she could muster, "I understand that you're angry with me, but please don't punish Officer Mitchell or Dr. Reeves for supporting appropriate patient care. If you want to fire me, that's your choice, but let's not involve others who are just trying to do their jobs properly." Wellington's rage reached a dangerous peak at what he perceived as condescension from someone he viewed as utterly beneath his status. The young nurse's attempt to protect her colleagues struck him as arrogant presumption, and his response would shock everyone present. "You think you can lecture me about appropriate behavior?" Wellington shouted, his voice echoing through the trauma bay. "You're nothing but a small-town girl playing nurse, and you have the audacity to question my decisions?" The personal nature of Wellington's attack crossed a line that even his most loyal employees would find difficult to defend. Several other staff members had stopped their work entirely to watch the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Dr. Reeves stepped protectively closer to Sarah. "Mr. Wellington, this has gone far enough. Nurse Martinez is a competent professional who's advocating for appropriate patient care. Your personal attacks are completely inappropriate." Wellington turned his fury toward Dr. Reeves. "And you're enabling her insubordination. I should have known that the medical staff would stick together against proper business management." The CEO's words revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of healthcare priorities and his view of medical professionals as obstacles to profit rather than partners in patient care. The divide between his corporate mindset and the medical staff's patient-centered approach had never been more apparent. What happened next would transform a workplace dispute into something much more serious. Wellington's anger had pushed him beyond rational decision-making, and his next actions would cross lines that could not be uncrossed. The consequences would ripple far beyond the walls of Metropolitan General Hospital. The confrontation had reached a point of no return. Wellington's face was twisted with an anger that went far beyond professional disagreement, revealing something darker beneath his polished corporate exterior. The emergency department had fallen unusually quiet, as if the entire space was holding its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. Sarah stood her ground despite the trembling in her hands and the rapid beating of her heart. She had never imagined that providing proper patient care would lead to such a volatile situation. But she refused to compromise her principles, even in the face of obvious personal and professional threats. Officer Mitchell remained frozen in place, caught between his duty to follow administrative orders and his growing discomfort with the direction of Wellington's demands. As a former police officer, he had developed instincts about when situations were escalating beyond appropriate boundaries, and every alarm in his mind was sounding. Dr. Reeves maintained her protective stance near Sarah, her years of emergency medicine experience having taught her to recognize dangerous personalities and volatile situations. She had worked with difficult administrators before, but Wellington's behavior was crossing into territory that concerned her both professionally and personally. The elderly Mr. Karachi, at best responsible, Thompson continued to rest peacefully in his hospital bed, unaware of the battle being fought over his care. His wife Margaret held his hand and whispered soft words of encouragement, trusting that the medical professionals around them were working in her husband's best interest. The irony of her trust was not lost on Sarah, who felt the weight of that responsibility more heavily than ever. Wellington's corporate empire had been built on intimidation and the ruthless elimination of opposition. Throughout his career, he had crushed challenges to his authority through a combination of economic pressure, legal threats, and personal destruction of anyone who dared to stand against him. The young nurse's continued defiance represented something he could not tolerate. "You want to be a hero?" Wellington sneered at Sarah, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're some kind of saint protecting the poor and helpless?" Sarah remained silent, recognizing that anything she said would only further inflame the situation. But her quiet dignity in the face of his attacks seemed to enrage Wellington even more, as if her refusal to be provoked was itself an act of defiance. "I've destroyed careers for far less than what you've done tonight," Wellington continued, his voice rising. "When I'm finished with you, no hospital in this state will hire you. You'll be lucky to find work cleaning bedpans in a nursing home." Dr. Reeves stepped forward, her professional composure masking the anger building inside her. "Mr. Wellington, your threats are completely inappropriate. Nurse Martinez has done nothing wrong except advocate for proper patient care." Wellington whirled toward the doctor, with renewed fury. "You think you're untouchable because you have a medical degree? I've replaced plenty of doctors who thought they knew better than sound business practices." The CEO's words revealed the true nature of his approach to healthcare management. In his mind, medical professionals were interchangeable components in a profit-generating machine, and their clinical expertise was secondary to financial considerations. "Sound business practices don't include abandoning patients who need medical care," Dr. Reeves replied firmly. "This hospital has legal and ethical obligations that supersede your financial concerns." Wellington's anger reached a new peak at what he perceived as intellectual arrogance from the medical staff. In his worldview, business executives possessed superior intelligence and decision-making capabilities compared to healthcare workers, and their challenges to his authority represented fundamental insubordination. "I'm done with this discussion. Wellington declared. Officer Mitchell, I'm giving you a direct order. Remove this nurse from the premises immediately and use whatever force is necessary. The explicit instruction to use force marked a dangerous escalation that shocked everyone present. Officer Mitchell felt his stomach tighten as he realized the CEO was asking him to physically assault a healthcare worker who had committed no crime except disagreeing with inappropriate orders. Sir, I can't do that, Mitchell said quietly but firmly. The nurse hasn't done anything that justifies physical force. She's just advocating for her patient. Wellington's rage exploded at this second act of defiance from his own security personnel. The CEO was accustomed to absolute obedience from hospital employees, and the growing resistance to his authority struck him as a coordinated rebellion that needed to be crushed immediately. You're refusing a direct order? Wellington screamed. Fine. I'll handle this myself. What happened next would haunt everyone present for years to come. Wellington stepped toward Sarah with obvious aggressive intent, his hands clenched into fists and his face contorted with rage. The transformation from corporate executive to potential assailant was swift and shocking. Dr. Reeves moved to intercede, but Wellington was larger and stronger, and his fury gave him a dangerous unpredictability. Officer Mitchell started forward as well, but the CEO's sudden movement caught everyone off guard. You want to be a hero? Wellington snarled at Sarah as he advanced. Let's see how heroic you feel when I break that pretty little face of yours. The explicit threat of violence crossed every conceivable line of professional conduct and human decency. Sarah backpedaled in fear, but the layout of the trauma bay limited her options for retreat. Wellington's advance continued with obvious malicious intent. Officer Mitchell lunged forward to intervene, his law enforcement training overriding his employment concerns. Dr. Reeves shouted for additional security while positioning herself between Wellington and Sarah. The situation had devolved from a workplace dispute into a potential assault in full view of multiple witnesses. But just as Wellington raised his hand toward Sarah, 3 figures appeared at the entrance to the trauma bay. They moved with the unmistakable bearing of military personnel, their presence immediately commanding attention from everyone in the area. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, Sergeant First Class David Kim, and Corporal Jennifer Walsh had been visiting their wounded unit commander, who was recovering from injuries sustained in a training accident. The 3 Marines were still in their dress blues, having come directly from a ceremony honoring fallen service members. Rodriguez, a 12-year veteran with tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, immediately assessed the situation with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive in combat zones. The sight of a large man advancing on a small woman with obvious aggressive intent triggered protective instincts that had been honed by years of defending those who couldn't defend themselves. What's the situation here? Rodriguez asked in the authoritative voice that had commanded respect in some of the world's most dangerous places. Wellington froze mid-motion, his hands still raised, but his attention suddenly diverted to the 3 Marines who had materialized with almost supernatural timing. The CEO's corporate confidence, which had served him well in boardrooms and business negotiations, proved utterly inadequate in the face of genuine military authority. Kim, whose grandfather had been a decorated World War II veteran, felt his jaw tighten as he took in the scene. The idea of a man threatening a healthcare worker struck him as a fundamental violation of the values he had sworn to defend. Walsh, one of the few women in her unit and accustomed to standing up to male aggression, stepped forward with the confidence that came from years of proving herself in a male-dominated environment. Her presence added another layer of authority to the Marine's intervention. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step away from the nurse," Rodriguez said calmly but firmly. His tone carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Wellington found himself in a completely unfamiliar situation. Throughout his corporate career, he had relied on economic power and institutional authority to dominate conflicts. But economic leverage meant nothing to Marines who had faced life-and-death situations in defense of their country. And his institutional authority held no weight with people who answered to a higher calling. "This is a private matter," Wellington stammered, his corporate bluster failing him in the face of genuine moral authority. "Hospital business." "Threatening healthcare workers isn't business," Kim replied flatly. "It's assault, and we're not going to stand by and watch it happen." The presence of the Marines had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the confrontation. Wellington's physical advantage over Sarah was meaningless in the face of 3 combat veterans who were trained to protect others and had no economic dependence on his goodwill. Dr. Reeves felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized that the situation had been diffused by the Marine's timely arrival. Sarah, who had been preparing for the worst, found herself breathing again as Wellington's advance halted completely. Officer Mitchell, who had been struggling with conflicting loyalties, felt grateful for the intervention that removed him from an impossible position. The Marine's presence provided moral clarity in a situation that had become ethically murky. Wellington's mind raced as he tried to calculate his next move. His corporate instincts told him to reassert his authority, but his survival instincts warned him that these were not people who could be intimidated through economic pressure or institutional power. The Marine's intervention had saved Sarah from immediate physical harm, but the underlying conflict remained unresolved. Wellington's threat had been neutralized for the moment, but his power within the hospital system remained intact, and his capacity for revenge was undiminished. The arrival of the 3 Marines had created a standoff that none of the participants had anticipated. Wellington stood frozen with his hand still partially raised, his corporate authority suddenly meaningless in the face of genuine moral force. The emergency department had become completely silent, except for the steady beeping of medical equipment and the sound of Wellington's heavy breathing. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez maintained his position between Wellington and Sarah, his military bearing projecting calm authority despite the volatile situation. His experience in combat zones had taught him that the most dangerous moments often came when cornered opponents felt they had nothing left to lose. "Sir, I need you to lower your hand and step back," Rodriguez said in the same tone he had used to de-escalate situations in Afghanistan. There was no anger in his voice, just the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Wellington's mind raced as he tried to process this unexpected turn of events. His entire adult life had been built around leveraging power and authority to achieve his goals, but these Marines operated under a different value system that rendered his usual tactics ineffective. "Do you know who I am?" Wellington asked, falling back on the intimidation tactics that had served him throughout his corporate career. "I'm the CEO of this hospital system. I have the authority to make personnel decisions." Sergeant Kim stepped closer, his expression remaining neutral, but his stance conveying readiness for any escalation. "We know exactly who you are, sir. What we don't understand is why you're threatening a nurse who's trying to take care of patients." The question cut to the heart of the matter, in a way that Wellington's corporate mindset struggled to address. In his world, financial considerations justified almost any action, but explaining profit motives to Marines who had risked their lives for principles seemed suddenly inadequate. Corporal Walsh moved to Sarah's side, her presence providing both protection and moral support. As a woman in the military, she had faced her share of male aggression and recognized the fear in Sarah's eyes as well as the courage it had taken to stand up for her principles. "Are you okay?" Walsh asked Sarah quietly, her concern genuine and immediate. Sarah nodded, though her hands were still trembling from the adrenaline of the confrontation. "Thank you for stepping in. I was just trying to provide proper care for my patient." Walsh's expression hardened as she fully understood the situation. The idea that someone would threaten a healthcare worker for providing patient care struck her as a fundamental perversion of civilized values. Dr. Reeves seized the moment of calm to reassert medical authority in the situation. "Mr. Wellington, this confrontation needs to end immediately. We have patients who require our attention, and this disruption is interfering with their care." Wellington found himself surrounded by people who were not intimidated by his position or susceptible to his usual methods of control. The Marines' intervention had not only protected Sarah physically, but had also shifted the moral authority in the room completely away from him. "This is still my hospital," Wellington said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "I won't tolerate insubordination from staff members who think they know better than management." Rodriguez studied Wellington's face carefully, recognizing the signs of someone whose worldview was being fundamentally challenged. "Sir, managing people and threatening them are 2 different things. What we saw here wasn't management." The Marines' words carried weight because they came from someone who understood genuine leadership through experience rather than corporate theory. Wellington's authority was based on institutional power, while the Marines' authority came from proven character and earned respect. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson began to stir in his hospital bed, his vital signs showing continued improvement under Sarah's careful monitoring. Margaret Thompson looked up hopefully as she noticed her husband's increased alertness, unaware of the drama that had unfolded around them. "Harold, can you hear me?" Margaret whispered, squeezing her husband's hand. "Mr." Thompson's eyes opened slowly, and he managed a weak smile for his wife. "I'm okay, Maggie. Just tired." The touching reunion between the elderly couple served as a powerful reminder of why the confrontation had started in the first place. Sarah watched with satisfaction as her patient showed clear signs of recovery, validating her decision to resist Wellington's discharge orders. Officer Mitchell approached Dr. Reeves quietly. "Doctor, should I call for additional security or notify hospital administration about this incident?" Dr. Reeves considered the question carefully. Escalating the situation further could result in more conflict, but allowing Wellington's behavior to go unreported would set a dangerous precedent for future patient care decisions. "Document everything that happened," Dr. Reeves replied. "The hospital's board of directors needs to be informed about threats made against medical staff, and we need to ensure this doesn't happen again." Wellington overheard the conversation and realized that his actions would have consequences beyond the immediate confrontation. The presence of witnesses, particularly the Marines, meant that his version of events would be challenged by credible testimony. "You're making a mistake," Wellington warned Dr. Reeves, "I have the power to make life very difficult for anyone who opposes me." Sergeant Kim stepped forward again, his patience with Wellington's threats clearly wearing thin. "Sir, you keep talking about power, but real power comes from protecting people, not threatening them." The Marine's words exposed the fundamental difference between Wellington's corporate authority and genuine leadership. Throughout his military career, Kim had served under officers who led by example and earned respect through their actions, not their titles. Wellington felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized that his usual tactics were not only ineffective but were actually making his situation worse. The Marine's intervention had transformed him from a powerful executive into the aggressor in a workplace assault case. Corporal Walsh helped Sarah check Mr. Thompson's vital signs, her medical training from military service making her a valuable assistant. The sight of a Marine helping with patient care provided a stark contrast to Wellington's attempt to interfere with medical treatment. "His numbers look good," Walsh observed, reading the monitors with practiced ease. "Whatever you did for him worked." Sarah felt a surge of vindication as she saw her patient's continued improvement. He just needed proper cardiac monitoring and medication. Discharging him earlier could have been fatal. The success of Sarah's treatment decisions provided concrete evidence that her resistance to Wellington's orders had been medically appropriate. The outcome validated her professional judgment and exposed the danger of allowing financial considerations to override medical care. Reeves began documenting the incident in detail, knowing that her report would be crucial if formal charges were filed against Wellington. The presence of multiple witnesses, including the Marines, would make it difficult for the CEO to deny or minimize his actions. Wellington watched his authority crumble as the medical staff resumed their focus on patient care while treating him as an unwelcome distraction. The Marines remained vigilant, but had stepped back slightly, allowing the hospital staff to handle their responsibilities while ensuring that no further threats would be made. "This isn't over," Wellington muttered, but his words lacked the menace they had carried earlier. The CEO's power had always depended on others' fear of his retaliation, but the Marines' intervention had broken that spell of intimidation. Rodriguez addressed Wellington directly one final time. "Sir, we'll be visiting our unit commander for the next several days. If there are any problems with the medical staff who took care of us tonight, we'll hear about it." The implied warning was clear without being explicitly threatening. The Marines were serving notice that Sarah and the other hospital staff were under their protection, and any retaliation would not go unnoticed or unchallenged. As Wellington finally retreated from the trauma bay, his defeat was complete though not immediately apparent. The CEO's corporate empire remained intact, but his personal authority had been shattered by 3 Marines who refused to be intimidated by titles or threats. Sarah continued caring for Mr. Thompson, who made a full recovery and was discharged 2 days later with his wife by his side. The elderly couple never learned about the confrontation that had nearly prevented Harold from receiving the care that saved his life. The incident became a turning point for Metropolitan General Hospital. Dr. Reeves's detailed report to the board of directors led to an investigation of Wellington's management practices, and the Marine's testimony provided credible evidence of his inappropriate behavior. Within weeks, Wellington found himself facing questions not only about the specific incident with Sarah, but about his overall approach to patient care and staff management. The corporate board, concerned about legal liability and public relations damage, began distancing themselves from his controversial methods. Sarah's courage in standing up for patient care, supported by the Marine's timely intervention, had exposed fundamental flaws in the hospital's corporate culture. The young nurse's willingness to risk her career for her principles had created ripple effects that extended far beyond a single patient encounter. The three Marines returned to their duties, but their brief intervention had demonstrated the power of moral courage in the face of institutional authority. Their actions reminded everyone present that some values transcend corporate hierarchies, and that true leadership means protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The confrontation at Metropolitan General Hospital became a case study in healthcare ethics, corporate responsibility, and the importance of supporting medical professionals who advocate for appropriate patient care. Sarah's story inspired other nurses to speak up about dangerous cost-cutting measures, and the Marines' intervention showed that ordinary people have the power to challenge injustice when they act with courage and conviction.